Thanks so much for the invite, Kara, and for folks for hosting this wonderful event, but also the Discord as well. Sounds like really interesting. I don't think I actually joined the Discord as of yet, but I have a Discord myself, and I am a big fan of using Discord to help manage community and collaborate with folks. Real quick, my name's Brian. I go by B Dougie on the internet. Spent almost 5 years working at GitHub, which I'll get into. Actually, I have some slides on this. And I'm here to talk about getting started open source. I have the slides that I am going to give is a talk I gave at a Google Developer Summit, and specifically around like finding success in open source. So that's what I'm going to go through. But before I start, I'd love for folks. Oh, someone said I can't hear what you're saying. Whenever it's them or me. If
I can hear you. For
okay,
other people, I'm going to assume since I can hear you, other people can hear you.
yeah.
But if you're not hearing, also, okay, you can hear too.
Yeah,
And
and I guess a
yeah,
quick test would folks tell me where your location is. So city, country, in the chat, and then also if you have an interest, language, in particular, frameworks that you're interested in getting involved, open source wise, drop that in the chat as well. It'd be helpful for me to perhaps share some more details based on your interest. But with that, I'm going to share my screen real quick and walk through some slides. So cool. So I run a project called OpenSauce. OpenSauce I've been doing full time for about a year. It's been like a side project for me since, well, a real side project since 2020, but I've had the URL opensauce.pizza since 2017. So there's a whole nuance about how I got started in doing this, but I'll leave it as that. Back in 2015, I actually made my first open source contribution to a Node project. And this was actually out of necessity, where I needed to solve a problem and found Node was like had a solution on GitHub. I actually didn't know how to use GitHub back in 2015. I completed a boot camp in 2013, and then was like a junior engineer for a couple of years. We didn't use GitHub properly at the job I was working at. We were using Jira to use issues, and then pull request were like used, but it was like we just weren't using all the features that were like available to us. So I didn't know how to, frankly, open up an issue on GitHub. I didn't know it was a thing because I used Jira the entire time. So what I'm getting at is I ended up reaching out to the person who created this project on GitHub through email. Because on github.com, if you have a profile, you could choose whether your email is public or private. And at the time, I think everybody's might have been public at the point, and at least in the API. But I reached out directly and said, "Hey, I want to use your thing. Don't know how to use Node.js on the server. I keep getting this error message. Like, what's the deal here?" And it turned out it was like Node.js had a split between IO.js and the regular Node.js to do ES Next features, ES6 at the time, or I guess 2015 was the actual version. But regardless, I had no context on any of that because I spent my entire career up until that point only writing Ruby code. So everything was given to me for free out of the box using Rails. And that was my junior engineering experience the entire time up until this point. So I guess what I'm getting at is like what I learned from this experience is this person was super friendly in a way that sounds like someone's got their mic pretty loud. I don't know if we can mute the manual. But the one thing that I was mentioning is that I got free mentorship through open source. I was able to level up and find out more about doing server-side backend Node.js code from this first experience. And it kind of completely shifted my career from just doing Rails to eventually doing way more JavaScript at that point. Moved to San Francisco shortly after this. I was based in Florida, but moved to San Francisco to start writing React code at an early startup back in 2015, which is pretty early for React days, if anybody's familiar with that background. But I mentioned OpenSauce, opensauce.pizza is the URL. And this has always been the goal for me to recreate that experience and find more places to make contributions. So like that's been the project since 2017 when I got the URL was how I could track my open source contributions. But it's also, it's been the goal since 2020 when everything went remote. I started live streaming on Twitch, building OpenSauce in public, mainly building front-end components and building some interesting things with GitHub Actions. But that was like the original goal. And then last year, I decided to take it outside full time. I mentioned I spent almost 5 years at GitHub. I call myself the Beyonce of open source. And the reason for this is because at GitHub, we had 100 million users worldwide. And it was my job to go interact with them and find out what was missing on GitHub. So I talked to all the top open source projects you've heard of, and engaged them and found that there was basically one GitHub action away from automating parts of their workflow for success. I did mention GitHub already, but so for the context of like getting started, I want to actually set the frame of like what is success and like what is the goals that folks are truly trying to achieve when you think of open source. I'll take a real quick break because I don't know if any folks dropped in the chat. If you're listening, feel free to drop in the chat. Actually, do they have access to the Zoom chat? I don't know if that's I guess some
They should
people
have
don't.
access. Yep.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, just a reminder, if drop in where you're currently sitting in as far as city and country, but also let me know what sort of interest you are looking for in open source. So if there's like a backend framework or a language that you particularly are fond of, let me know that. So a year ago, we actually partnered with DigitalOcean for the initial launch of OpenSauce. It was a private sort of beta launch. I probably even call it alpha. We built a dashboard for DigitalOcean to identify spam during Hacktoberfest. This was like not a thing that we were going to go to market with. It was just like we knew we could solve a problem because we could collect a bunch of data on open source through my knowledge of how to work with GitHub previously. So we went forward with that and we built this tool called the Insights platform for OpenSauce. And quite honestly, I didn't know if this was going to be the future of the product. Currently, it is the product today. But the idea there is that Insights is the opportunity for you to see across the entire ecosystem in language or frameworks. So like Dokkan just mentioned Node.js being like one of the things I'm familiar with, but also Golang is something that we use internally at OpenSauce. So this is all open source contributions for Golang in the last 30 days. And the idea there is if you could see someone else do open source, you have a better context of like how you could make approach to make contributions. And there's like a bit of pattern matching. Like I grew up from an underrepresented background in the US and got a finance degree because finance was an optimal career for me I didn't have any money. So if I could learn how money is made or how money works, I could probably make more money. Which is like true and not true. But I graduated at the wrong time where there was no jobs in finance. So I ended up going in sales and then eventually teaching myself to code while getting my MBA. So like that's my quick other half of my story before I did open source. But the idea there is like I want to be able to highlight what's happening in ecosystems, seeing what's trending, seeing what projects I could potentially work on. And the idea there is like during Hacktoberfest, it's the same question is like, where can I make contributions? And we wanted to provide a quick way for folks to showcase where the trends are happening and like where you can make contributions. Because I think the majority of folks, like when you introduce yourself into open source, you look for like the biggest projects because you think the biggest projects probably have the best place for you to onboard. And it's usually the opposite. Like it has great structure, but it's just like trying to get in college. Like you've got to go through a approving system, like whether it's like take your SAT or prove that you're just not going to disappear or flake. So like Ruby on Rails being one of them, like great place to make a contribution, but not a great place to make your first contribution. So what we would try to do is like highlight more first-time contribution areas that don't necessarily need to be good first issues. And I think that's one of the misses that our entire industry has been hyper-focused on good first issues, where folks, they accelerate into making one contribution and disappearing forever. And I think the one thing that I learned in like my experience with the Node.js project I contributed to is like it's best when you connect with the human and connect with that person who's maintaining, and that gives you like a good hand-holding experience to make a contribution, whether you're a junior, whether you're a senior, whether you're staff level. And I think what we've seen in the trend in the last couple of years is a lot of senior engineers who have never done any open source did their first open source contribution during COVID because they had way more time to think about and find other outlets to grow and like have a connection to a community. And we saw a lot of communities really take off in the last couple of years in open source. So on GitHub, like you can go into the repositories and you can see contributors, like a list. So this is Veet. So you can see Evan Hughes face right there. You can see Patak, you can see Anthony Fu, the first three folks on the right. And then you can kind of see like who's made contributions. So like the one thing you see off the bat is like Evan doesn't actually have any contributions in this time frame. Anthony, the same, like Anthony and Evan are really good starters. But like usually other folks like Patak will come up and maintain. So like right off the bat, like that's insight that you probably didn't have up until today, and I said it. But you want to find, when you're reaching out to folks, you want to find the person who actually is making the contributions to ask the questions to, because they have the more context day to day. Evan would not be the best person to reach out to about Veet when it regards to code. But if you want to talk about like vision and future and partnerships and like having a work at your day job, as far as like maybe like if you work at Cypress, get Veet to work in Cypress. That's a better pitch to Evan. But if you're looking to make your first contribution, Patak's the person you want to reach out to. Patak's the person with the cat as a avatar. But the other thing about these like blobs is you could also see contributions over time, but you get no context of what those contributions are. And this is something you could find easily through the GitHub API, which is rate limited pretty heavily. And what we want to do is provide way more context of what's actually happening in these blobs. So the first thing we shipped a year ago for DigitalOcean is like being able to highlight alongside the blobs what contributions are, what are these peaks. So like any contributors tab on the Explore page, or what we do have is like you can create insight pages for custom repos that you want to follow. And then you can see a good high level of what contributions look like in the project. And again, the goal is you can see other people doing it, so that way you can put yourself in that same place to be able to know, okay, what steps or what type of contributions are actually getting merged and accepted. A lot of times people will walk in with like some random fix to the package.json, but it might not be needed. So like understanding what contributions actually make it to releases is super helpful for folks knowing how to interact with contributors. Because the worst thing you can do is interact the wrong way, not read the contributing MD, and just take a bunch of time away from the rest of the folks that are trying to make contributions and keep this thing alive. Some other stuff that we've been playing around with, which hopefully will return to the product before the end of the year, which is highlighting types of contributions. So because the advent of AI and semantic search and like all this machine learning, I used to work at a company called Netlify years ago, and we use heuristics to identify. Heuristics is like a term for machine learning. You pattern match to identify what types of sites are deploying. So when we look at the code for open source, we want to identify what types of code is being contributed to. So like refinement or refactoring is refinement, should be refactoring there, but new features, maintenance, dependency updates, like these are all things that have a different classification, and identifying what types of contributions are actually getting merged in. Chances are if you walk in there with a new feature, it's going to take a lot longer. Because perhaps you didn't have a conversation with the maintainer, perhaps you didn't jump in their Discord. Like those are things that actually require some investment and time. But if you're just trying to do a dependency update or trying to do some quick fixes, the thought there is like you should probably still have like an issue opened. And like we're starting to track like correlation between issues opened to PRs opened, and folks who have a high frequency of opening up PRs with no issues. Like doesn't need to be detrimental, but it should like set up you either for success or for maybe more conversation with the maintainers. And the other thing we've been working on is the Oscar rating. So there's an open source contributor reputation score, which is identifying frequency of contributions and impact of individual contributors. So if you look at what I was showing of Evan and Patak and Anthony, like you could actually see clearly, okay, there's a lot of movement from Brandon, who's all the way on the right. And then this new contributor is more likely just getting started, or maybe it's infrequent as contributions. Maybe they're not doing full-time engineering, but maybe solution engineering, or maybe just doing some DevRel type stuff. So basically, again, like you get a high level look at what's happening in the project pretty quickly. Some of the things that we've been playing around with is like identifying contributions across folders in a visual representation, which is this tree map. If you ever use like the Webpack Analyzer from years ago, or other services like on Grafana, it kind of gives you a visual representation of who's shipping code. This is actually currently in a open PR. It's a draft PR, so it's not live yet. As well as the stuff previous, it's not live yet, but you're more than welcome. It's all open source, so you're more than welcome to take a look at that story. But as I sort of wind down and move into demo land, I just wanted to highlight a conversation I had with Brendan Burns, who's the co-creator of Kubernetes. He mentioned as he was like establishing Kubernetes as a community, he noticed there's like a really strong correlation from issues to interest. Like stars really don't matter in the whole scheme of things. Like everyone looks at stars first, but what really matters to stars is like if you get 100 stars in a day, that matters. If you have 50,000 stars, that really doesn't matter because you get at 50, like jQuery has 47,000 stars, but jQuery is a maintenance project. Like there's no more new contributions happening to jQuery that are not security updates. So stars for that reason don't matter, especially if the project's been around since 2008. So issues is a really good indication for interest because if folks are opening issues, there's some interest and some hope that things will be fixed or new features will be added. If there are no issues, it's either a brand new project or a low interest project. The other thing is PRs and adoption. If there is a high frequency of PRs outside of the organization owners or the maintainers, there's a high chance that there's some adoption elsewhere that's not just this core group of friends. So like if you're looking to evaluate projects for adopting yourself, like that's a good indicator of whether or not this is something that you would put a lot of work into, or perhaps there's a big community. So something like quickly to look at, stuff that we've been working on in open source to approach. So the conversation on YouTube, youtube.com/open source if you want to find it. Some other stuff that's still also, unfortunately, still in a draft PR. Our engineer was stuck in Burning Man over the weekend. So he's safe, but they're now ready. They're going to be ready to work on this stuff and complete this stuff this week. So yeah, fun stuff. But yeah, they also took off a week for Burning Man. So we're a little bit behind on getting this stuff launched. But the other one thing I wanted to mention as well is our API. So a year ago, I knew I wanted to solve a problem. I didn't know how to solve the problem. And we probably over-engineered an API first because we wanted to build a product, but we knew we just needed to collect the data and decide what to do with the data first. So the first thing we did was we actually shipped open source as an API. So using Swagger. So maybe a lot of us are familiar with Swagger. If you're not, it's definitely worth looking into. But we were able to build a quick little framework for our API, which actually I misspoke. We didn't build a framework. We actually use a framework, which is called Nest.js, N-E-S-T JS. And it's just like if you use Next or if you any other thing like Rails, you can generate a bunch of models and services for your API. And it gives us the ability to to provide a list of repositories, lists of PRs in a way that's consumable. So like the ultimate goal for open source is that anybody can build on top of open source. So if you have like a need for data, if you have a need for identifying contributions, or you want to create a little quick CLI service to you, or text yourself every time a good first issue or a PR is open, like that stuff you can build on top of open source. With a caveat of like you'd be super early. Like we're only a year into this, so if you wanted to build me on top of open source, you probably have to have a lot of questions with me and the team. But the goal is to get to the point where we can have a product that anybody can build and integrate with. It's another note about like getting started in open source. Building, like making contributions to the main core project is one thing, but building contributions and like the extensions in like the ecosystem of projects is actually a better first like good contribution. So like when you think of like things like Stripe, if like making payments inside of Django or Rails or Next.js or whatever it is, like integrating with that SDK and making contributions to the SDK is a better first like area, because usually it's slower moving, there's less updates that are happening, there's usually like one or two core contributors that you can reach out to pretty easily, and it's very clear who those folks are, as opposed to giant behemoth projects that have lots of moving pieces like Kubernetes. So like a better tool, and actually we talked about this in the Brendan Burrs conversation, because Brendan still maintains some side projects for Kubernetes. He's like a VP of something at Azure now, but he still has a bunch of like small Kubernetes projects that he could still have fun with and like feel like he's still making code contributions pretty regularly. There's actually a lot of those projects that he contributes to, but the idea there is like you can go to Brendan and see what he's working on at open source and identify opportunities for you to make contributions. So this is like the actual UI itself for open source. Earlier this year we decided to create a sort of profile page for folks to be able to showcase their contributions over time. So these are mine, and apologies, like I noticed everything's basically slow, so I'm not sure what happened recently, but everything takes a little bit to load. But this is like the representation of like the contributions I make. So like I'm CEO of we have a company established. We took VC funding, which means I do less coding. I'm doing way more sales and engagement on that side, but these are my contributions over the last 30 days. And then the other opportunity that we're looking to is like being able to reach out to people and request for collaboration. So if someone opted in, like I I'll struggle to actually, I'll show you that in a second. But the other thing I also want to mention is that as you onboard, we actually ask you for your interest. So that way we can recommend projects that have an influx of contributors too. I have a bit of story. I'll punt on that for a second and why and how we're doing this recommendation algorithm. It is all open source. You can go in the API and look into it. Contributions are welcomed. But the one thing I did want to point out is like we on the Insights tab, so like the main product is Insight Pages. You're able to add a bunch of projects that you're interested into, or maybe projects you're maintaining. And the idea there is once you've added the projects into one dashboard, you're able to see all contributions for just those repos. So like I was showing you before, all of Go, but in particular, you probably don't want to see all Go all the time. You probably want to see like a handful of projects. So these are all the folks who've made contributions. And the way this graph works is these are lines touched, which is not the best metric to only look at, but it's the best metric to see the sort of weight of contributions that are currently open and ready to be merged. So the idea there is like Brandon's currently working on a bunch of like really lofty fixes. He also maintains a project called Analog, so a lot of that stuff gets embedded in here. We should probably have a filter to filter out non-interested projects, but what I'm getting at is the actually that's I don't know who this guy is, but a docs fix. Yeah. So anyway, this is the list of projects. These are the projects. These are the list of contributors that are currently within my Insight page. And then we have like this little flag for anybody who's a maintainer, which is super useful if you want to know just that same question about like, should I reach out to Evan or should I reach out to the person making the most contributions? It's a combination. So the folks who have merge rights and part of the org had the maintainer flag, but they might not necessarily, because like I'm a maintainer, but I'm not constantly making contributions in the project. So for that reason, you probably want to reach out to Brandon or John. But what I was getting at is the recommendations. Oh yeah. Now there was another thing I was going to mention, and I just completely, it would have been a perfect segue, but I completely forgot what it was. But and the last thing I'd show you, at least on the UI side, is the highlights feature. So like there's going to be some projects that we haven't actually indexed. The way we're doing this is anything over 100 stars, we're indexing preemptively for you. It's about 250,000 projects now today. But there's probably some things you want to highlight and showcase in your resume as far as a contributor. So we give people an option just to tell us what projects that they would like to see in the form of a highlight. So we could never solve the problem for everybody, but this was like a nice way for early contributors or smaller projects to get some showcase in open source and us get a signal on stuff that's happening across the ecosystem. It's also, we'll eventually start building a resume out of these highlights as well as contributions. So yeah, stay tuned for something before the end of the year. So I mentioned all this because the API is how we started. We ended up building a UI for DigitalOcean. So this is actually what I meant to say is like, this product is the DigitalOcean product that we built. We ended up reforming it into something that was more usable post Hacktoberfest. But they will also have like a specific Hacktoberfest dashboard for folks to watch as well. But what I'm getting at is that's this. But as far as way more stuff in the back end, I did want to mention our CLI. So if anybody has any questions at this point, like feel free to drop them in there if any as far as like your personal open source journey. But the CLI is something that we actually shipped. I don't even remember the first commit was like 3 months ago. We wanted to, as I mentioned, build on top of our API, and the CLI was like a perfect place to build more cutting edge features quicker and have like a little sandbox for us to test different things out without committing something into the UI and like being stuck with it. And that was like this constant battle of building a product of like you ship something, maybe someone likes it, maybe someone doesn't. Best thing you do is talk to your users and your customers, but not always. You don't always have users and customers. So what I have here is I've got our pizza CLI. So if you want to install this locally, we have the actual name pizza on npm. So it's just npm install pizza, and then you basically have the latest version, which I think we need to unstick that version. So it should be 1.0, but I'll have to check on that after this. But basically, we have this pizza CLI, and the idea here is if you want to see insights on a project, so just like our insight pages, you can bake repos. So the idea is like if you pizza bake, and I'm gonna need help, so I'll do the help URL. So pizza bake, HTTPS. Actually, oh, it's just a naked URL. Huh? Sorry, I have used so many different versions of the CLI in testing, so I don't actually remember any of the commands. And I'm gonna just add the app. So the idea here is that I can bake repos, and then I can start asking questions from the repos that I've baked. So the thing I'd wanted to show is contributor insights. And this is something that I keep trying to segue to, but pizza insights. Sorry, I'm currently working on a open repo, or sorry, open PR, and nothing's committed or made it to release yet. So I'm like, it's not in the help docs yet. But I'm running a command which is pizza insights contributors. So I want to find insights on contributors, specifically on a list of repos that I have in this file. The one thing I'd probably mention is the repo.yaml is an option for us to list a bunch of repos. So I can bake the repos, but if I just want to always have like a list of repos to like fetch, I just put a list of repos together. So Kubernetes CLI, CLI is the GitHub CLI in particular, and then Next.js. So just like roughly projects get a lot of contributions and a lot of data. And I don't know how I did that, but I copied that. Let's try this again. Oh, insights. Cool. And then what this is currently showing is something that looks pretty. Trust me, this is really interesting. It'll be way more interesting. We put some visualizations on this. But the idea here is that we can see based on the CLI, they've got like in the last 30 days, and everything's time bound to 30 days for now. We'll eventually have a flag to do like 60 to 90 days to 12 months. But for now, everything's 30 days just for us to be able to test it quickly. But of the CLI, there's only 10 repeat contributors, so folks who came back month over month. I do know the CLI team is a team of 2, so there's a good chance that 8. We haven't actually got the data yet for splitting between org members and non-org members, but 8 people who don't work for GitHub are contributing to the project. So that's just like insider information I know. But then when you look at Next.js, you got 55. So the Next.js team is closer to like 20 people. Sorry, Next.js is not a 20-person team. Vercel engineers that probably touched the project is around 20. So you have about 35 people who are coming back over month. So the idea there is like you probably have more than 50% of the folks who don't work at Vercel come back and make contributions. But the one thing that we actually identified last month in preparation to go pitch Vercel on using this is 85% of new contributors, or sorry, 85% of the contributors that made a contribution are brand new contributors. So these are folks who have not contributed in our time bound of 90 days. So chances are they came back or they're alumni, but we haven't quite sliced the data yet. But the other thing that's pretty interesting is like the folks who churn, who don't come back and contribute, is about 67%. So there's a bit of it's like almost they were scorching earth every month and making new contributions. So like the story that we're eventually going to be identifying in this process, and again, this is open source. If anybody has data scientists or anything like that, feel free to reach out. But the story there is like there are good first issues or contributions that people are making in Next.js that only require one contribution, and folks just like make that contribution and leave, which is like not a good or a bad statement. It's just an interesting thing to observe. So as we start diving into this data more, we'll probably identify there are certain, like whether it's documentation or whether it's like extensions. So Next.js, they use Turbo and they have a bunch of like packages inside of the Next.js package. So there's a good chance that maybe folks are building the MDX package or are contributing directly to just MDX and not the entire Next project, or they're building like some API feature in Next.js that has a really a strong cohort of contributors. But this is something we'll figure out in the next couple of weeks, actually. I'm actually looking at this data later today. But I just wanted to point out that there's like interesting stories we can get out of projects. And then speaking of like these stories as well, we built this little thing because everyone's doing AI. So we figured why not we just use OpenAI credits as well. It it's funny enough, we used the credits, but we went like a completely different path than most people are considering when it comes to AI for GitHub. But I'll show you like the path we have today, which is I'll ask a question. So this is like an endpoint this is a feature inside of the CLI to ask questions to any repo and then get an answer. So if I github.com/ so in the context of the pizza of the CLI, everything's a URL because when you do a remote for Git, it's always a URL. So I'm just going to use a GitHub URL, but you could use whatever GitLab or self-hosted URL as long as it's a remote that you can attach to and you have access to or permissions to. So I'm going to grab just our main open source app. And just like I'm baking a repo, it's just going to check to see if we've actually indexed it too. So in addition to baking, it's also indexing. And it's indexing into a semantic search tool called Quadrant or Qdrant. I don't know how to pronounce it, to be quite honest, but it's how I pronounce is how you spell it, Qdrant. So like we've indexed the repo, and now we should be able to ask questions like, how do I get started? And it should go look at the repo and give me a quick little answer. So it's looking at their README. So like the way it was written, it's like this telling you exactly what it's doing. So to get started the app, you can refer to the README file. Not super helpful. Yeah, and good luck. So we have trained it to basically be nice. So that's actually not in our README, but it looks like that's what it is. Contributing guide. It basically just said you look at the contributing guide. So we'd have to give it some more bounds to basically say go read any URLs and then give us answers based on that. But that sounds expensive. But the other thing I've been testing at is a lot of times when I'm looking at sounds like I got sounds like I got that. But I think here we go. Post. Yeah. So basically a lot of times when I'm looking at like UI, I usually want to know like what color this button is. And I know you can like inspect and eventually find out what orange it is, which is like FF5100. So I mentioned that because in the context of looking at a repo, it'd be cool to say like, what is the color of the orange highlight button? But post highlight button. And the idea that it's just to go into the repo and then give you a very trivial response of hopefully FF1500. But think about if you wanted to ask like, how do I approach writing tests in this project, or has somebody because usually you're working on a behemoth of a project, has someone wrote this type of code for this situation, or do we have a framework to solve this problem? So like this is like the most trivial way to approach doing semantic search and AI like embeddings with OpenAI. The next step that we're actually going to be layering on top of this is actually contributor contribution data. So because we know who's contributing to what project, the thought there is going to be in the list of repos that I'm currently baking, who is a top Python contributor, or who's the person who wrote the most tests within this project. So like answering those types of questions that you could do with a multiple Chrome tab situation where you're just like looking at every single project and like, okay, it looks like Brian's the one that did most of it. That context could be made, but it looks like, man, this is actually taking a little longer than it should. But I did want to actually walk through the code real quick. And then again, if anybody has any questions, I don't even know, haven't really been paying attention. I did see someone's from Accra, Ghana. It's like Python, Golang projects. Felix has got a backend Node.js from Nigeria, and they got more Node.js. Cool, excellent. Well, let me show you some Go projects. So this is actually the pizza oven. So the pizza oven is like the engine below everything that's actually providing like the indexing of the Git commits. So if you're interested in how that works, that's there. But I did want to show you the actual CLI itself. The CLI is a project. It's a CLI project built on top of Cobra. So if anybody's done any Go, SPF13/Cobra is like the CLI tool for everyone to get started doing CLIs. There's some other tools out there, but I think Cobra's been around the longest. John, who's actually engineering with us, he's the maintainer of Cobra. So when John joined, it was just like, hey, John, why don't you make a CLI and see what we can do with that? So it's been a little fun project for him. And then we have this contribution I just showed you with the insights. It's been yeah, I guess only a couple of weeks actually, which is pretty nice. I couldn't even Seco Basque, based in Ireland. He's been actually prototyping and getting feedback on that insight, contributor insight thing. And then everything else, like contributor insights is like one of our main features at this point, because we haven't really done a lot of work into developing features, but we do have a ton of issues. So if anybody's interested in, well, we have, it says we have a ton of issues. I said we have a ton of issues. We have a bunch of issues that we have in a private repo that we've been planning that we'll be converting over to here. So I think we have about like 20 issues with features that we'd love to see in the CLI. So stay tuned or just click watch on the repo. But all these are up for grabs if you're interested in taking a look at that. The only ask that we have that we've actually noticed as far as like being successful in open source is that folks will say they want to work on an issue, but provide no context on who they are, their background, the approach. So it might be like weeks that we assign the issue to somebody and like no response. So we're actually going to be like slowing down on how fast people can get assigned to issues and require people to provide some sort of, how are you going to approach this? What's your interest? Mainly because, yeah, we're just getting folks to assign themselves to a bunch of issues and not a lot of movement, which we don't want to discourage people from like jumping in and trying things. But we want to encourage people to like provide some conversation and context, because we have a lot of context that we could share, like especially like stuff like the pizza props, which is going to be like an Easter egg feature. But the best thing you can do is like this, like provides some sort of interest or like activity. The one thing I will mention that we have this like Chrome extension that we built as well. And it gives us the ability to be able to look at profiles to identify if folks, like where they're coming from, what contributions they made. And it's like, it's a lot easier because a lot of times you could see like someone's LinkedIn to identify if they've worked at a company or if they went to a boot camp. But that's usually to get translated into like into GitHub. So here I can see John's done some work. He's got some contributions and he's created some highlights on our platform, which gives us a good indication that, okay, John will probably not disappear on us if we assign him to the issue. So that's basically what I'm getting at. It's like we have a quick little fix to like identify if someone's like where they're coming from and like what their background is. But yeah, I don't think I'd be the best person, because I didn't write most of this code, to walk through the code base itself. But it's open source. You're more than welcome to do it. I think we actually have some pretty good in code documentation. Eventually we'll have some documentation for the CLI once we ship a couple more features. And then the other thing I would mention is that repo query thing. It's actually a Rust project, so I didn't see a lot of people interested in, or sorry, say they were interested in Rust side. But what we found is every time we went to index a repo in TypeScript, it was taking like 25 minutes to index just one repo. So we have this individual, Anush, who's a GitHub Octern. So his Octern ship's actually in next week. But GitHub had an Octernship program where you could pair or be partnered with a open source project to get paid a stipend every month. For basically like the summer of code, very similar. And he had done some Rust and knew that Rust could be a way to parallelize. Anyway, basically add some concurrency to the situation. So we got it down from 25 minutes to like about 30 seconds to a minute to index even the largest repos. So not sure what happened. It seemed like I had a failure on my question. So I'm not sure what happened there, but I'll look into that in a sec. Yeah, some sort of I think I got too specific with post highlight button, but I'll look into that later. Seems like something that I can fix. But yeah, this project itself it's a Rust project. We do have some explorations to switch over to Chroma DB, which is a fun little project. But we did find that the Chroma was a little too early for us as far as like a project to leverage. So we're currently sitting tight on that. But yeah, as I mentioned, everything that I showed is open source, and happy to get issues and commentary on just about anything. Like, we're building a product for folks to do open source. And if you're interested in open source, like, it's the best place to make your first contribution. really love the AI feature regarding how to contribute prompt. Maybe GitHub could add that AI aware feature to the repo. Yeah, that's a funny thing. It's GitHub actually is building this. So by GitHub Universe, you'll probably have an announcement around the Copilot for X. And Copilot for X is going to be a feature. Yeah, I actually don't know if this. You said this is recorded, but I don't know if this is going like somewhere publicly. I've got so many more details about Copilot, but I don't know how many of those details are actually public yet.
Mhm.
But I'll thought myself there to say Copilot is going to have a bit of those features that I shared. They do have it currently, and you can ask a repo questions as a Chrome extension, or sorry, not Chrome extension, a VS Code extension. But we just took a different approach, mainly because we had some extra bandwidth with our Octurns, and we wanted to explore some stuff while we had the extra bandwidth with them. So yeah, but all ideas are valid. Would love if anybody has any other thoughts. I think Evan, you actually tweeted out they would like to identify sentiment based on how to comment. So how do you rewrite your comment on GitHub to be positive and not rude? Because I think sometimes that could be a loss for some people who English is not their first language, and you might come off harsh in some responses. So we actually have an open issue for that in our AI repo, which I didn't share because there's only so much I could talk through. But yeah, it's basically all built in TypeScript. It's a Chrome extension. It's what you're seeing here, and we have. Oh, it sounds like we have a. Oh, I need to merge this thing in. I need to actually review this PR. But yeah, we have a couple of interesting features just to help expand someone's resume using this Chrome extension.
This is so awesome, Brian. I haven't actually seen seen most of this latest stuff, but I feel like it's really helpful for anyone who's looking to get started, even for me to do some more more contributions myself. It's really awesome.
And
yeah.
This is we built a lot of this in the last 6 months. So like we built the main product. We actually went through Techstars in January to April. And then we ended up raising our seed, like I guess it closed April. No, actually closed in March, but officially in April. And then we basically scaled the team up slightly. So we went from 4 to now 7. And we're now able to kind of explore and do a bit more stuff while we're working with our future customers. So this I wanted to share as well. It's like this is our sort of high level infrastructure of how this all works. So like everything that you see on the Insights tab is this. But then we have the API that's basically the control plane for everything. We're running on Postgres is our database. And then we have the CLI that connects to the API directly. And then we have this pizza oven that actually has a direct connection to our Postgres. So the pizza oven is like basically how do we circumvent rate limiting, but also how do we own the data we're actually sourcing from Git commits. So the way we're doing is we're not actually sourcing code itself. We're sourcing knowledge on commits and SHAs. So like if you have the SHA, you could go pull up GitHub or whatever your service is for your Git provider. So that's what's going on over here. And then we have this vector DB, which I showed you a bit with the repo query. And then we have a bunch of like, honestly could be serverless functions for now or edge functions. But for now we have like a server that runs a cron to do a bunch of emails and source data and duplicate stuff and stuff like that. So this is a bit of a powerhouse that we need to actually clean up quite a bit, but haven't had the bandwidth yet. But yeah, that's the open source journey, and yeah, a bit of a demo of the CLI.
Awesome. Well, we can see if anyone has any other questions they want to drop in the chat while we still have you. I feel like a lot of what people shared of looking to start out on open source and Node.js and Golang projects, I feel like they're pretty clear action items. Yeah, from what you covered. So hopefully that's a good start. But if there are any other questions, they're awesome.
Yeah, and the best thing you could do is I dropped a link to the open source link. I guess you can use open source pizza too as well. If you just populate the interest that you want, also let us know if there's not an interest that you're interested in that's in the list. But we have like a very constrained list of interests, and then the goal that we've been doing is that we've been partnering with maintainers and companies to help support them in their open source needs. So the one thing that I learned, like when I started this a year ago, is everyone does the whole intro to open source, good first issue, help developers, but no one actually talks to companies or maintainers about how do you find contributors, because like their needs are very different than someone who just learned how to do open source today. So if we can help bridge that gap by leveling up contributors and like finding folks who already have the skill set of engineering, but just show them that open source is a great way to expand the resume. Like that box is checked. We have an intro course for folks to go through that we have in our docs. But then the other half is, okay, now companies who don't get all the open source contribution or the awareness, how do they get awareness? And that's the thing we're working on right now.
Awesome. That's super cool.